Welcome to Feminist Question Time. It's brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. In 2018, Women's Declaration International wrote a declaration on women's sex-based rights, which lays out our position. It's nearly 7,000 words long, and it's based on United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against women, sort of saying, let's keep the word sex to mean sex, not gender identity, an idea in people's heads. The declaration has been signed by 39,750 people from 160 countries, supported by 547 organizations, although actually a few more have signed it recently. To promote this declaration, we have volunteer activists, including country contacts from every continent. Do join us. Now, I'm really pleased because today we have four fantastic speakers. We have Sheila Jeffries, who is going to be talking about the campaign for the sexual abuse of children in the 1970s UK. Then we're going to hear from Tamarack Verrall, who's from Canada, why I signed the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. So we're going to hear about that. Then we're going to hear from Dansky from the USA, two US Supreme Court cases involving male athletes demanding to compete in women's sports. And then we're going to hear from April Chainey about how she found the Declaration, how she found out about this gender identity ideology, and she signed the declaration and why she signed it. We're going to go now to our first speaker, who is Sheila Jeffries. She's from UK stroke Australia. Sheila Jeffries is a radical lesbian feminist author and activist, and she is a co-author of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. So this talk is about the campaign for the sexual abuse of children in 1970s UK. So thank you so much, Sheila, for coming, and over to you.
Sometimes the campaign by men's sexual rights activists to wipe out women's rights that's taking place right now, and the terrible cruelty to the bodies of children that they're campaigning for, it seems astonishing and surely unprecedented, but it is not. Something similarly extraordinary has happened before. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, that is almost 50 years ago, there was a campaign by gay men in the UK to reduce or abolish the age of consent so that they would be able to access children legally for sexual use. They gained a considerable amount of acceptance on the left. In non-government organizations, they were promoted in lefty magazines. They were affiliated to the National Council for Civil Liberties, which is now called Liberty. And this reached levels of approbation that we couldn't imagine on this issue today. However, this demand for men's sexual rights resembles, in the way it was promoted and seen as progressive, the campaign for men's sexual rights in relation to transgenderism that has reached a much greater degree of acceptance even today. In both cases, these men's sexual rights campaigns were extremely harmful to children. I think it's worth looking at the earlier time and comparing it with what's happening now. Though the idea of transgender rights may seem unprecedented, it certainly isn't. Something like this happened before. And it was successfully defeated in the same way that we are defeating the campaign today. In the earlier times, there was a considerable social movement towards sexual liberalism, which enabled the campaign to sexually use children to seem progressive. After all, Germaine Greer, in her book The Female Eunuch in 1970, argues for the legalization of incest. At that time, much progressive legislation was being passed, and there was a generally liberal political attitude towards sexual minorities. One aspect of this liberalism was the move amongst social work organizations to reduce the age of consent to 14. It was 16, as it is now. supposedly because this would be of an advantage to sexually active girls. So it was always done in the name of girls. The gay male campaigners were able to piggyback on this attitude towards the age of consent, and there was a very general feeling that it was necessary to lower or change the age of consent. And of course, the gay men joined in on this, as we shall see. But there was also a strong feminist movement which opposed this liberalizing impulse and ensured that the age of consent remained at 16. One of the things that makes this campaign interesting now for FQT is that two of the three directors of WDI were involved in the feminist campaign that was created in the late 70s to oppose the male campaigners. So Maureen O'Hara and I, two of the three directors, were there 50 years ago. And we are here now, which is, I think, pretty incredible. We were both living in Leeds at that time, and we formed a group in 1978 to campaign against the demands to create sexual access to children, which was called the Leeds Women's Liberation Age of Consent Working Group, and we were successful. The age of consent was not lowered or abolished, but it was a fierce struggle. I was particularly concerned about reducing the age of consent because I was a historian. I knew that the age of consent was only raised to 16 in order to reduce the prostitution of teenage girls that was prevalent in the UK in the late 19th century. So the feminists wanted a barrier to men simply being able to use teenage girls. The age before that was 12, and men used girls from that age onwards as their right. To see a campaign to lower this age of consent that feminists had fought so hard for, to protect girls being advocated as something that was in their interests, was a shock to me. In the campaigns in the 1970s, no mention was made about prostitution. It was as if girls and boys, men and women were on a level playing field, but feminists knew that was not true. There are similarities between what took place over the sexual use of children and what has taken place over transgenderism. In both cases, completely unacceptable demands for harm to children are central. And in the case of transgenderism, many and serious harms to adult women as well. In both cases, those campaigns to destroy the rights of others have been supported by those associated with the Labour Party, many other organisations and personnel on the left, who see themselves as progressive. In both cases, feminists were opposed by those people on the left and struggled to be heard. In both cases, it looks likely we will be successful. Today, I will use the materials that are in my archive from 1978 to 1980. My archive is very extensive, but I've got a file on this. And it's got campaigns from, it's got magazines from PI and other gay male organizations dedicated to sexually using children, and the writings of these men promoting the sexual use of children in lefty publications at the time. I will use too the submissions to government commissions by organizations like the National Council for Civil Liberties and social work organizations. It's a nice little record, and I would like to, I thought, talk about it. Before I look at what happened then, I would like to have a word about language. Some while ago now, a French feminist called Malcolm Markovitch, who was involved with me in the feminist struggle against trafficking in women for prostitution, explained to me that the term sexual abuse is problematic because it implies that there is a wrong sexual use, i.e. abuse, so there could also be a correct use. But there is no such thing as a correct sexual use of anyone, of course. Women and children are sexually used for men's pleasure because they're not seen as equal human beings with dignity, but objects for use. So it's therefore correct when speaking of the harmful behavior of men to women and children to speak of sexual use, I think, rather than abuse. Not that that's how it would necessarily be seen to those who are being used. Use is always an incontrovertibly harmful when relating to human beings. I've used the term abuse in the title of this because it's more easily understood, but I will probably use the term use as I go through. Now, the campaign was waged by a number of gay men's organizations One was PIE, pie. Apparently, you can be censored on YouTube if you use the word that the P stands for. So I'll try not to. I'll spell it out here, PEDOPHILIA. Another of the organizations was Gay Activists Alliance, and there were several more. They made rights claims, in this case, that the access of adult men to children was a matter of the children's sexual rights. No children were, of course, involved in the campaign. Children were not demanding access to adult males and likely had no idea what the adult males had in mind. So it was a hugely dishonest campaign. Gay publications carried articles by these men explaining why it was a matter of children's rights to ensure that they could choose to be sexually used by adult men. Left-wing and alternative publications carried their work too, and as I said, the National Council for Civil Liberties had PI as an affiliated organization. Now, the Leeds group that Maureen and I were in, or set up, in 1978, there's a submission by it in my archive, handwritten. We probably typed it later, because there was a parliamentary inquiry taking place, part of which was about whether the age at which children could be seen to consent to sexual activity should be lowered. The inquiry was called the Policy Advisory Committee of the House of Commons on Sexual Offences. The group's submission to the inquiry explains why it had to be set up. So here we are, Leeds Women's Liberation Age of Consent Working Group. We are a group of women who became aware that the Policy Advisory Committee was receiving evidence from several organisations which pressured for a lowering of the age of consent and came together in an attempt to ensure that it is retained at 16 for heterosexuality. Now, half of the feminists who were involved in the group, including me, were members of the Leeds Revolutionary Feminist Group at the time. In 1980, Maureen O'Hara got a piece published in The Leveller, which was a lefty magazine, and it showed her and the group's opposition to lowering the age of consent, why we did, and it was very nice and clear. This is Maureen. The sexual freedom at issue in attempts to abolish the age of consent, because yes, some of these organizations wanted to abolish it, not just lower it, is the freedom of adult males to relate sexually to children. So I'm going to look at some of the arguments that Pi and other campaigners made at the time, and that the degree of social and political acceptability that they managed to achieve. So who were the campaigners? Apart from some liberal social workers, which may have included some women, though all those I've seen quoted have been men, the campaigners were gay men. The two most prominent groups were Pi and the Gay Activists Alliance. The Gay Activists Alliance is self-evidently gay and did not include lesbians to my knowledge. In its evidence to the Policy Advisory Committee, it stated that the age of consent should be abolished and meant sexual use of children legalized. So here we are, Gay Activists Alliance recommendations. The decriminalization of homosexuality and paedophilia and sexual acts thereof. And that's a problem, isn't it? The decriminalization of paedophilia. The abolition of the age of consent laws. Their submission is in their magazine called, which has the title, Child Temptress Chased Man to Bed, and this was 1979. So this was a gay liberation group, and gay liberation at the time in the 1970s was very much, parts of it were very much in favor of sexual access to children, and that was seen as a legitimate demand. Many gay men saw attraction to teenagers, including in many cases prepubertal boys, as part of their sexuality. But of course, this is their demand here is to access to children from birth onwards, because there's no age in it. Other gay men, though, were very angry at these demands, and they said that campaigning to use children supported the long-time slur against gay men that they were child molesters and not safe with children. So there was definitely a battle between gay men about this. Now, also, this is another man from Pi. He says, Stephen Adrian, he says that incest, where both partners freely and happily consent, is no better or worse an expression of family love than any other. So incest was fine. Um, I think the reason that they said this is because they felt that heterosexual men needed to be included, and they mostly had access to children in their families, so it was important to make incest possible as well. Yes, so they said, men in the family had their daughters to rape, and so they needed the penalties removed. Now, the male gay campaigners knew that it was problematic that there were no women campaigners for sexual access to children, and that could look bad. So they gave explanations, such as the fact that women could legitimately cuddle children and thus were not starved of access to children. They also just kept stating that there were female child sex abusers, but they were quite unable to produce any. In all of this literature, there are no women saying anything whatsoever. They just kept saying it, hoping that that would be accepted. Now, the community of men interested in sexually using children and happy to promote this publicly at the time, extended beyond Pi itself and the Gay Activist Alliance. There were a number of other groups. There were a number of newsletters. There were also a number of gay and left-wing publications that gave platforms to the campaigners to make their arguments. And one of these was The Leveller, which described itself as an independent socialist magazine. As well as lefty publications platforming the campaigners, some of the campaigning gay men themselves argued forcefully that they were socialists or specifically Marxists. Those campaigners who sought the support of the left by saying they were socialists made the argument that the restriction on men's sexual use of children emanated from capitalism. This is Keith Hose. He was the chair of Pi in 1978. And he said there was a golden age of child sexual use before capitalism developed, and that capitalists saw gay men's desire to use children as a threat to institutions on which capitalists depended, such as the nuclear family. He says, I think that because paedophilia threatens some of the institutions of capitalism, that capitalist society effectively puts it down. In Britain, before capitalism, one gets the impression that things were more free for paedophiles. But now sex and any interaction between adults outside the family and children are restricted. He says that a paedophile relationship widens the family and questions who is going to bring up children. It was a worry to the paedophiles that parents often got in their way and didn't want these men to be using their children or taking them out for the day or whatever. So that needed the family needed to be brought down so that the men could get in there. He also says that a lot of teachers have come across this. However, they thought that teachers should be able to access children as well. I know that some that work with ESN children, is the children with special needs. They say they find these children need a lot of affection. It borderlines on sexual as well. ESN, meaning children with learning difficulties. Now, Pi also had its own journal called Magpie. It's very cutesy, and it's worth sampling their wares. They published a series of articles by the Dutch P-word man, Edward Brongersma. At that time, the Netherlands had a reputation for being particularly liberal in the legal availability of cannabis in shops, for instance. And so it was reasonable to assume that they would be liberal, and they were very liberal in terms of the age of consent. He was a politician. He was quite open about his proclivities and campaigned for access to children, whilst being for several years a member of the Dutch Senate for the Labour Party and chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. So he was very respectful and completely out there. This was completely possible in the Netherlands at the time. He said, nearly every man and woman has a percentage of paedophile tendencies in him or her. It's a question of more or less. So there you are. we are all potentially paedophiles. We've just got a little bit, every single one of us. So that's okay then. So some men just have quite a lot, and we've all got a little bit. Kind of extraordinary arguments, wasn't it? But there were people accepting these arguments. Now, some of those within the pie community thought the pie went too far and could offend the public. One of them was a writer in the socialist magazine The Leveller in 1980. He was a member of a group called the Campaign Against Public Morals. You'd think that wasn't a very sensible title, Campaign Against Public Morals. But so he was in the Campaign Against Public Morals, and he preferred to be anonymous. And that was organized, that was created, the Campaign Against Public Morals, to organize the legal defense of a member of PI who was on trial for offences such as distributing child pornography, child sexual abuse offences, and so on. In fact, there were quite a few of them who were being prosecuted at that time in the very early 1980s for their actual offences against children. But he was, perhaps this is why he was anonymous, a very forthright child sex abuser. And he says, yes, here we are. In most cases, it is children that initiate sexual relationships with adults. And he also says, surely a person of any age knows if penetration hurts. So the child would be able to say, don't do that, please do something else instead. You'd think that he would be worried that people might not like what he said, but he thought he was being respectable compared with Pi. And he says many non-Pi paedophiles, women and men, do not want under any circumstances to be associated with Pi policies. And the piece that he wrote was called Nicer Than Pi. So it's kind of extraordinary. It's difficult to get your head around it as you are looking at what these men actually said. Now, there was, and I want to go on to look at, the support from civil society for these organizations and these men. Now, the degree to which civil society organizations supported lowering the age of consent is demonstrated in a piece in the magazine for social workers called Social Work Today. So these accepting discussions were happening in social work magazines. In a 1980 edition, Leonard Davis, a lecturer in social work at Brunel University, wrote that the age of consent should be first lowered to 14 and then abolished altogether. So 14 or 15 and then abolished altogether. In another social work magazine called Rapport, which was the Community and Youth Service Association journal, a youth worker called John Kirby gave his thoughts on sex with children. He says that he is not a P word. He hugs, he says, both boys and girls. He says also that it's okay if teachers have sexual relationships with their pupils. So it's fascinating how sort of out and straightforward they are about the fact that these men are involved with children and are using children. It's kind of extraordinary, really. So this is John Kirby in Rapport. He says, some people, while accepting the arguments for adult-child sexual relations, exclude those such as teachers who have care and control of children from having such sexual freedom. Some of us mightn't we? We might say teachers shouldn't do that. Penalties imposed on convicted paedophile teachers who had a relationship with a pupil have been particularly harsh. The P words are naturally drawn to work with children and to exclude them from forming sexual relations with children on the ground that the teacher-pupil relationship, for example, if it's of a special kind, is an extra burden for them to face. And we don't want them to have to face that, do we? Child sex abusers should be able to freely have relationships and not feel that there's restrictions upon them. Now, this was a social work magazine, remember, that was carrying all of this. Now, the National Council for Civil Liberties also supported lowering the age of consent. This is the National Council for Civil Liberties. Evidence to the Criminal Law Revision Committee, February 1976. So this was actually earlier. This movement to lower the age of consent started quite early, and the NCCL was quite involved in it. Where both parties are aged 10 or over but under 14, a consenting sexual act should not be an offence. If one is over 10 and under 14, a consenting act, should not be an offence. Where so basically they wanted it lowered to 14, but they wanted those who used the girls to be young. But a 10-year-old is quite young, I think, and not fully developed in their genitals and so on. So it's slightly surprising that they would want this lowered to 10. But the NCCL went further than that. Members of the organisation at the time included Harriet Harman, who went on to become deputy leader of the Labour Party, her husband and fellow Labour MP Jack Dromey, and former Labour Health Secretary Patricia Hewitt. They were all prominent figures in the NCCL, and the NCCL granted Pi affiliate status in 1975. The Pi magazine Magpie announced delightedly in its issue of 1978, May 1978, that the NCCL support Pi's rights. They state that at a recent AGM, there was a motion. This AGM condemns the physical attacks on those who have discussed or attempted to discuss the sexual abuse of children, and reaffirms the NCCL's condemnation of harassment and unlawful attacks on such persons. So these men were seen as a sexual minority who should be protected from being disapproved of, and the NCCL, now Liberty, has a motion to protect them, and the motion was passed. Now, campaigners to lower the age of consent rather than abolish it altogether, did twist themselves into all kinds of knots, like we've just seen, trying to establish that children could give meaningful consent if they were a particular age or whatever. And I wrote about this in a piece in 1980 in the Leeds Women's Liberation newsletter. And I was talking about another civil society organization that took up the cause of lowering the age of consent. And this organization was called the National Council for One-Parent Families. Now, that was mostly composed of women, and was seen at the time as being sort of roughly feminist because women were the one-parent families. This organization was for them. So this is me writing about the age of consent. So the National Council for One-Parent Families suggests that after a rigid age of consent law is abolished, age and mental capacity should still be taken into account in deciding whether a child can give consent. The law should prescribe that consent will be presumed to be absent if the subject of the alleged sexual assault, irrespective of her age, is for reasons of physical or psychological maturity, and this is what they say, disagreement about when penetration should take place, bodies should be too small. So presumably, before the court case, the child's vagina would have to be examined to see how large it was and whether it was the right size to be penetrated. Or because she is suffering from mental disability, incapable of giving a real consent. This means that the court will have to establish what it considers to be the individual age of consent, that is, for each child who comes before it. This would clearly result, I suggest, in an unworkable confusion. The man involved would not be charged with an offence until partway through the trial. A defence for the offender, the National Council for One-Parent Families suggests, would still be that he thought the girl was capable of consent. In the case of a child, consent would mean that she allowed an adult to abuse her. This is what I'm saying. It would mean that she allowed an adult to use her for his sexual satisfaction, because, of course, these children are not going to be approaching these men and be asking to be used. And she obeyed his instructions. So that's what consent would mean, that she didn't try to stop him because she didn't know what was going on, and she obeyed the instructions of the man. Can a child consent, I say, to something she does not have any conception of? So consent was really quite a problem for them. And Keith Hose of Pi had trouble with the issue of how to establish consent and the age of consent when the child being used was pre-verbal. And this was something that the paedophiles really had to think about. If they wanted to be able to use children from birth onwards, the children cannot express that they don't agree. And here he suggests one possibility, using an example of a woman and a child, which has nothing to do, of course, with sexual use. He managed to find somewhere, presumably in some anthropological literature, that there was a society here about there was a society, South American Indians in this case, where, the issue of consent came up, and he says, if you have a case like the South American Indians, where the grandmother is licking the genitals of her grandchild, then it would be unfair to put her in prison just because the child cannot communicate. It could communicate by stopping crying. But is that communication? Right? So he's saying that, if you were actually using a child sexually and it stopped them crying, that would be it giving consent. I mean, there's no way this grandmother was involved in sexual activity with the child. That's absolutely not what was going on. But this he uses as a form of defense. So that's it for lovely quotes from Pi and other organizations. Pi was closed by its leaders in 1983. There had been increasing arrests of its personnel for offences against children, and they were by then thoroughly discredited. There's been no resurrection of a public campaign by gay men for access to children, though we know these men are still there. Where are they? I mean, interestingly, there have been several convictions for offences against boys of transgender activists who are, of course, gay men in this case, in recent years. I hope I've shown that there are good reasons to know about the 70s campaign to normalise gay men's sexual abuse of children. There are a number of similarities between the earlier movements and transgender rights campaign today. The sexual demands of both these movements are in flagrant opposition to the rights of children, and in the latter case, the rights of women, but they've been promoted by rights organisations, civil society organisations, and those who see themselves as progressive in a similar manner. It looks as if their fates being overthrown by furious feminist campaigners will be the same, but unfortunately, we have to remain vigilant against men turning any more of their sexual perversions into rights campaigns in the future.
What happened in the 80s and 90s to the activists who were promoting all of this?
They left the scene because there were prosecutions happening and they couldn't keep their organizations going. So pretty much the campaigns, the forthright campaigns ended at that time. They weren't happening after Pi was closed in 1983. In the later 80s and 90s, we didn't have to deal with this. And the campaign to even lower the age of consent, because it is still 16 in Britain, went away. I think it looked bad after it came out what the men were doing and what the men were demanding and so on.
And do you think that you, through the activism of your Leeds organization, changed public opinion? And were there other feminist groups apart from your group?
I'm not completely sure of that, but I have read that there were feminist groups throughout Europe because these campaigns were happening in Germany and in France and even in the US who were fighting the same battle we were. So there was a general fight back by feminists. I don't know whether we got to public opinion because I'm quite sure public opinion would have been against, as they are now on trans, what these men were demanding. What we needed to get to, and I think we did get to, because we did all of these submissions, we did a lot of work, was the lawmakers, the policymakers, the people who could actually make things happen. I think we did get through on that level.
I really like your quote saying, "Can a child consent to something she does not have any conception of?" Can you explain why that's so relevant today as well?
Well, we know that actually children wouldn't be able to imagine being the opposite sex unless they were trained to do so. There's absolutely no possibility. Then they would have no conception, of course, when they are actually being having terrible medical misconduct done upon them. They have no idea what is being done, what it would mean for their fertility, for their bodies, for their general health, for their whole way of being in society. They have absolutely no idea about that. So the ignorance of children is being used by adult predators in a similar way today.
Lots of women are asking about what Germaine Greer said about incest or about this issue. Could you tell us again or explain it?
Yes. In her book, The Female Eunuch, there is a chapter on incest in which she sees people uh, joyfully frolicking with each other in the family, as it were. So, yes, she doesn't see incest as a problem. I mean, I would have to go back and look at the book carefully to see whether she has any age limits in there, and I'm not sure, and I can't tell you that exactly. But I was horrified when I read that book, and it put me off the book. It really did. The idea, because the Punishment of Incest Act 1908 in the UK was fought for by feminists again. There'd been no limitations on what could happen in the family. Feminists fought for that. And I'm keen to keep whatever we have fought for and prevent the abolition of these crucial laws. But certainly, she said the penalising of incest should be changed.
I've seen her in interviews saying she's not a feminist and she doesn't speak for the feminist movement. And I think I've heard you say perhaps she wasn't really embedded in the feminist movement at all. She's more of a thinker who's been said to be a feminist, but she actually wasn't in the movement. Was that true?
The fact is, she never came to anything that was movement related. I never saw her. I never met her. I was fairly well integrated and well known within the feminist movement in Britain. I don't think anybody ever saw her or met her. She wrote her books and she didn't really have anything to do with any of us. If she had had anything to do with any of us, probably the general ideas of a movement would have affected her and she might have thought differently on some things. So she was very individualist. I love some of her work and I love her being absolutely strong on transgenderism, but she wasn't a movement feminist, whereas I'm definitely a movement feminist, as are you. We're embedded in a movement, responsible to it. Our ideas are generally understood within that movement.
It was also during the 70s that feminist social workers began to reveal how much child sexual abuse there was in families stroke societies. It did become a much more explicit then. Was that not part of the revulsion which affected Pi?
It's possible. And I don't know the answer to that, Lynn. I'm not saying that we as feminists managed to do this all on our own, because of course there were prosecutions of Pi, and that certainly helped change the attitude towards them. When they were revealed to be just very nasty, some of them very nasty child sex abusers. So yes, I suspect all of these things came together to change the atmosphere.
I understand that Section 28 in the UK was proposed, introduced by Margaret Thatcher's government, partly as a reaction to the perception that gay rights and the Pi campaign were integrated. What's your view on that?
In the late 1980s, the Conservative government, which was very upset that the Greater London Council, which they abolished, had been funding gay organisations, women's organisations, and so on. And they introduced an amendment to the local government bill which said that local government agencies, whatever they funded, whether it was schools or whatever it was, should not be able to promote homosexuality to try and stop any of this happening. It had a very chilling effect on the promotion of gay rights at that time and lesbian rights, there's no question. Um, but um, I I don't know. I mean, yes, the Conservative government, they lied about all of the things they were saying. I don't think they really were concerned exactly with what gay men were doing, because they talked about hairy-legged lesbians. They particularly didn't like lesbians, and lesbians weren't paedophiles, and they didn't think that for a moment. So yes, and they were ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, anything you think of. So I don't think it was particularly and necessarily connected with paedophilia. I certainly didn't understand it to be so at the time. That's all I can say, really.
Ted Heath was a supporter of the ECC, so the European Community, but not the EU, the European Union. He took the UK into the EU regardless. And it says it was widely accepted he caved due to reports his paedophilia would be exposed and was blackmailed. And do you recognize or not arguments to lower the age of consent is to some degree a means to protect those in political power? And so she says basically there's an argument that the UK would not have joined the EU in 73 had it not been for paedophilia. Complicated idea.
Yes, that's a fascinating idea, and I know nothing about that. I do know all of the rumours that have been online multiple times about Ted Heath, who was Prime Minister at that time, being involved in the sexual use of boys. And of course, I'm not in a position to say exactly whether that was true, but the rumours said things such as he had a yacht parked near Brighton when the Conservative Party conference was going on, and boys were brought to him, and there was apparently a network of boys at that time, and this has been reported on in various serious media, of men who worked in children's homes and the allegation is, and the rumor is, that they used these boys and trafficked these boys onto that yacht and into other places. There were also other Conservative MPs in particular about whom there were considerable rumours of all this kind of thing. But I don't know, and these are the things that are on the internet, and who can exactly tell what was going on. So I've no idea whether rumours that they would be exposed had anything to do with serious political events at the time. But there was certainly a lot going on, and I do think there's probably no smoke without fire. So there certainly were men in the higher ranks of the Conservative Party who were involved in dubious connections and so on at that time. But more than that, I cannot say, I'm afraid.
We'll now move on to our next speaker, who is Tamarack Verrall. And Tamarack is from Canada. She's a feminist since the 1960s, an out lesbian since 1972, based at various times in Montreal, Ottawa, Vancouver, USA, with travels in Europe, India, and across North Africa. She's a member of World Pulse, a global network working to end violence against women and girls everywhere. Thank you so much, Tamarack. You're going to come on and tell us about why you signed the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, but also give us some insights into what you think about things. So thank you so much, Tamarack, and over to you.
I'm 76 years old, an activist since the late 60s. In 1968, we opened a small women's center in Montreal, one of the first in Canada. One doctor was willing to provide abortions, and women came from all over the world. And our center had mattresses on the floor for women to heal before and after the procedures. This is just background to the work that lesbians do and have done for so many years to help women heal. The women's movement has always had fierce leaders who were and are lesbians. We care about women. We're dedicated to a future in which all women are free. In 1972, I was aware of discussions across the USA and Canada as the later LGBT movement formed. Promises were made. We would recognize each other's differences, the men respecting women's culture, and the extra work that we were doing to end violence against women and girls. We were and are lesbian feminists, lesbians determined that all women be free. The resistance and the punishment for even speaking about women's liberation deepened our commitment as we took on the description of radical lesbian feminist. We took on these words to find each other and to let the world know that we exist. We were spat upon for using these words, words that signal that we were working for deep change, radical change for women and girls. Within the LGBT plus movement, we were and too often are ridiculed because we challenge men to end what is called euphemistically man-boy love, the misogyny of drag theater, glorifying the blatant sexualization of women's bodies, and most recently, the indoctrination of children into the concept of changing sex. For the most part, as lesbians, we have been, and are busy holding female circles, helping women and girls heal from violence done to them by men, and continuing our work for women's rights. Despite the vast differences in how we were living our lives, what our purposes were for our lives, the later LGBT plus umbrella grew, with those initial promises held, with gay men taking responsibility for male chauvinism within their circles, and to some degree, for a short time, challenging the involvement with children. Fast forward to today. The punishment of women is swift and widespread, pointed specifically at lesbians for speaking of, let alone creating time and space in which we have a moment to ourselves in female-only company, labeled TERF, trans-exclusive radical feminists, enemies to be destroyed. 3 years ago, I decided to go to the LGBT parade here in Montreal because, according to early traditions, leadership rotates, and it was the year for lesbians to lead. I know many would question why I bothered to go, but I wanted lesbians to be visible. Just before we were scheduled to begin, a well-known 6-foot-tall trans took the front of the parade with a megaphone, joined by about 100 others, calling out, "Kill all TERFs." The organizers did nothing. I kept walking to be present and got cheers from many. Refusing to leave and being purposefully visible, I continued to point my poster to the crowds on the sidelines. "Proud to be a lesbian," it reads, "out since 1973. I got lots of cheers from women along the way. It had been a dilemma whether to stay or go, whether to be visibly associated at all with the sick mess of misogyny and pornography in front of me, calling for the murder of me, of lesbians, of women whose closest relationships are with other women, women who carried and offered traditional circles that are female ceremony, circles that my foremothers were murdered for, burned as witches, now betrayed by men who demand that the very definition of woman be rewritten. I felt it important to stay in the march, to be visible while equally aware of both the risk of my being seen as associated with the gang carrying the hateful message, "Kill all TERFs," broadcasting the message that sadomasochism and men flaunting their nakedness is cool, that drawing children in is ethical. My dilemma continues. Lesbian visibility in a pride parade? What about public accountability for the disgraceful display of overt sadomasochism, naked men, violence, and the erasure of the meaning of the word woman? On the way home, my sign still visible, a young woman came running out of a store asking to speak with me. She described the violence that she was being subjected to in a relationship with a trans. I can't bring myself to use the term trans woman. From our conversation, she later sent me a message that she had managed to get away. Trans politics are a new form of patriarchal control. The demand with threat of punishment that we redefine the very meaning of the word woman. The immediate labeling of anyone even calling for discussion that we be determined enemy and silenced by any means. The criminalization of ever meeting intentionally as women. Throughout time, under patriarchal control, the simple act of meeting in female-only company is seen as a signal, a call for attack. Silencing and public displays of intimidation are widely advertised as deserved. Any form of disagreement, of reporting violence, of offering, holding, even speaking a female-only space is labeled as deserving of attack, being fired from work, denied opportunities to even speak on panels for open debate. Any mention of the concept of female-only space, any challenge of the violence under this so-called LGBT plus umbrella, this coalition, so-called, is met with more violence. None of this is new to anyone tuning into these meetings, but the details need repeating. Across Canada, in any way that we continue to build the women's movement, we're labeled discriminatory for creating women's centers, for making ourselves available to women for healing and empowerment, for continuing to name these ways, old and new, of the punishing and silence for us who are doing this work. Our outspokenness is critically important to prevent this violence from being seen as the acceptable norm. Few of us are able to take on this risk. I am one who can. I don't hold a job with an employer who might, through fear or reprisal or fear, be accused of being anti-trans, fire me for speaking. We've been working for a world in which we're free to meet as women, a world in which we're not maligned and punished for speaking, even about the concept of female-only meetings, ceremonies, centers for healing, centers for discussion, respected as leaders, as healers, for teaching the next generation the customs and traditions that we continue to carry. These new forms of violence within the so-called LGBT plus community need to be recognized for what they are. The attempt to redefine the word woman, the normalization of punishment of women, the takeover of any leadership by women, ongoing patriarchal control. I'm a healer. I've spent my life creating and offering healing, these healing circles for women and girls. I'm one of a very few who can speak publicly, risking harm. At age 76, you cannot get me fired from my job. You can't tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm compelled to speak because I've lived the results of this new doctrine as it's been created. We can rework the past as we move forward together, but to find our way, all forms of control and violence toward women and girls must be recognized and stopped. These wolves in sheep's clothing, these emperors that have no clothes, fooling people who genuinely do want a world in which everyone is free to be themselves. We need to face this dangerous mess, these dangerous demands being made from what's now called the LGBT plus umbrella. Listen to women, listen to the survivors, carry the courage and the wisdom to bring back free speech, debate, collective decision for a very different path forward as this human race. Honor the ancient traditions of women. I lived to see this happen. This is why I'm grateful for these international meetings. None of this is new to any of you here, but it needs to be said. Thank you, Women's Place UK. Thank you, WDI. Thank you for this global circle.
Okay, we're going to now go on to our next speaker, who is Kara Dansky. Kara Dansky is a lawyer, a public speaker, and a feminist. She served as president of WDI USA from 2021 to 2024 and on the board of Women's Liberation Front from 2016 to 2020. 2023, she published The Reckoning, How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls. She currently writes on Substack at the Turf Report, which is highly recommended. Today, Kara Dansky is going to talk on two US Supreme Court cases involving male athletes demanding to compete in women's sports. So welcome, Kara, and over to you.
I will be talking about two cases concerning male athletes who would like to invade female-only sports. So in order to really understand the significance of these cases, you need to know two things by way of background. On 3 occasions, the U.S. Supreme Court has refused to take up the question of whether single-sex spaces are allowed under federal law, and the case that eventually became Bostock versus Clayton County, and why so many of us are very frustrated with our Supreme Court. So, US federal courts have decided at least 3 times that schools are not allowed to maintain single sex spaces like bathrooms and locker rooms, and the US Supreme Court has refused to address the question. Those cases are called Doe versus Boyertown, Grimm versus Gloucester County, and AC versus Martinsville. In 2 of those cases, female students were demanding to use the locker rooms and bathrooms that aligned with their male gender identities, and the school refused to let them, so they sued. In both cases, they won at the lower court and appellate levels. The school district, in both cases, asked the Supreme Court to get involved, and it refused both times. In the other case, a school district established a policy during the summer of 2017 that allowed students to use the locker rooms and bathrooms that aligned with their supposed gender identities. A group of students that consisted of both female and male students sued, alleging that this violated their right to single-sex spaces. They lost at the district and appellate levels and eventually asked the Supreme Court to take the case. It refused. In all 3 cases, radical feminist groups filed friend of the court briefs, practically begging the Supreme Court to weigh in on the matter, to no avail. The case that eventually became Bostock originated as 3 separate cases. 2 of them involved gay men who were fired for being gay, and they challenged their employers in court. The third was a case involving a man named Amy Stevens, who had decided that he was a woman while he was working at a funeral home, where Harris is the name of the funeral home. He demanded to be able to use the women's restroom while at work and be referred to as she, her, and Ms. The funeral home eventually fired him, and he challenged the funeral home in court. All 3 of these cases made their way up to the Supreme Court. The U.S. chapter of WDI didn't exist at the time, but I was serving on the board of the Women's Liberation Front, which filed a friend of the court brief in support of the funeral home. We presented all of the radical feminist critiques of so-called gender identity. There was a rally on our side of the issue outside of the Supreme Court in the fall of 2019. Having been there, I can report that it was basically a tiny handful of radical feminists in an ocean of conservatives, and I'll explain why I'm making that point. At some point, the Supreme Court decided to join all 3 cases, which we knew meant disaster for women and girls as a sex class. And sure enough, in June of 2020, the Supreme Court announced its decision. Discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or transgender status constitutes sex discrimination under our employment discrimination law. Although the court said that employment discrimination on the basis of so-called transgender status was unlawful sex discrimination, it did not say a word about what transgender status means. Justice Alito issued a dissenting opinion saying that the federal judiciary would be mired for years in litigation about the reach of the court's decision. I don't particularly like Justice Alito, and I never have. He's the conservative justice who authored the Supreme Court's majority opinion in the case that overturned Roe v. Wade. However, he was 100% right in his prediction. On January 21st, on the first day of taking office, President Biden issued Executive Order 13988 on combating and preventing discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Biden said in this order that all federal agencies would have to change their laws and policies such that sex would be interpreted to include so-called gender identity. He based all of this on the court's 2020 decision in Bostock. Now, the Supreme Court didn't even say in Bostock that sex has to be interpreted to mean so-called gender identity under any federal law at all. It didn't even use the phrase gender identity. Bostock was a bad decision because it protects people on the basis of their transgender status, whatever that means, in employment, but it didn't say a word about gender identity. That didn't stop the Biden administration from claiming that it did. Biden just went with it. Also, the Supreme Court explicitly limited its decision to the employment context and said it wasn't talking about sports bathrooms or anything else. Nonetheless, Biden said, It had to be applied to every single aspect of US federal administrative law. So, US radical feminists essentially lived in gender identity hell for all 4 years of the Biden administration. And although Trump's executive orders have fixed a lot of that, they can't fix all of it. There are countless lawsuits currently percolating through the federal judiciary about what words like sex, woman, man, and gender mean. It has been relentless since 2021. Two of those cases are called Little versus Hecox and West Virginia versus BPJ. Those are the cases that are currently before the Supreme Court. In 2020, the state of Idaho enacted a law titled the Fairness in Women's Sports Act, which the governor signed into law in March of that year. The governor's name is Bradley Little, which is why the case contains his name. Shortly after he signed the law, the American Civil Liberties Union, where I once worked, was ready with a complaint on behalf of a male athlete named Lindsay Hecox. Lindsay claims to be a woman and wanted to compete in women's track and field at his university. The following year, 2021, West Virginia enacted a similar law titled the Save Women's Sports Act. Again, the ACLU was ready with a complaint on behalf of a male athlete. This time, the male athlete was a minor whose puberty has been blocked. He's known in court documents as BPJ. Both state laws mandate female-only sports at educational institutions in the states. Both challengers are male athletes. The only difference is that in the Idaho case, the male athlete is an adult whose puberty was never blocked, but who has been suppressing testosterone through the use of exogenous estrogen. In the West Virginia case, the male athlete is a minor whose puberty has been blocked. I used to have some sympathy for BPJ because his puberty has been blocked, which I think is terrible. However, it has since come out that BPJ has been sexually harassing female athletes using vile language that I won't repeat here. Any sympathy I once had for him has evaporated. In the Idaho case, the ACLU and the male athlete won at the lower level, and 4 years later, 4 long years later, again at the appellate level. In the West Virginia case, the state actually won at the lower level. That no longer matters, but it's an interesting fact because the judge who ruled in favor of the state's protection of female-only sports was appointed by President Bill Clinton. To the best of my knowledge, that was the first time a U.S. federal judge appointed by a Democratic president ruled in favor of the material reality of sex. In any event, at the appellate level, both states lost to the ACLU and to these male athletes. Both states asked the Supreme Court to intervene. WDI USA filed friend of the court briefs encouraging it to do so. And in 2025, the Supreme Court finally agreed to hear these cases. Finally, many of us thought. Finally, the Supreme Court is going to tell us that women and girls are entitled to female-only sports under the law. Not so fast. WDI USA filed another friend of the court brief on the substantive questions at issue in the cases, and we cited the UK Supreme Court's April decision from last year in the For Women Scotland case. This past Tuesday, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in both cases. I was not inside the court for the oral arguments. I was outside at a rally for female-only sports. I'll get to the rally in a minute, but first a few words about the oral arguments. Since Tuesday, I have read the transcript of the oral argument in the Idaho case, and I'm sorry to say I'm no longer hopeful. I still need to read the transcript of the oral argument in the West Virginia case. To be clear, I think the states are going to win these cases in a win for female-only sports, but I don't think the Supreme Court is going to go nearly as far as I want it to, and I think it's going to use disastrous language. I was extremely disappointed that every single person in that courtroom that day who spoke during oral arguments in the Idaho case, all of the lawyers and all of the judges seemed to use the word transgender with the assumption that it has a coherent meaning and that we all know what that meaning is. At least from what I know, from reading the transcript of the oral argument in that case, no one questioned it at all. Now, to his credit, Justice Alito asked the lawyer for the US government what the word sex means, and the lawyer responded that it refers to reproductive biology. So that's not nothing. But no one asked, what do you mean by transgender? So that's disappointing from my point of view. We still have this concept of transgender status from the Supreme Court's 2020 opinion that has gone completely undefined in the law. And unfortunately, I'm not hopeful that the Supreme Court is going to clear it up in the current cases. The group Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender will be hosting an X Space at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on the 19th of this month. I realize that's a terribly inconvenient time for many of you, but for any of you who can make it, please do. Several of us will be offering our thoughts about the oral arguments, and if we can, making some predictions. And I hope to have much more to say about the arguments in upcoming weeks. Now, to the rally itself. I mentioned earlier that during a rally in the 2019 oral arguments in the case of Bostock, the rally participants were a handful of radical feminists in an ocean of conservatives. That has changed measurably in the intervening 6 years. At Tuesday's rally, there were radical feminists and conservatives for sure, but there were also newer groups like the LGBT Courage Coalition, which is similar to the LGBT Alliance, and Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. These are all people who generally hail from the political left and who are furious with the Democrats and the establishment left for throwing women and girls under the bus. The mood was extremely upbeat. These are just some photos from the rally. So you can see these are all signs that loudly proclaim Women's Declaration International. We talk about being feminists for women's sports. On the far left of the picture, you can't see the full sign, but it's an LGBT Courage Coalition sign that says "Stop Transing Gay Kids." The woman you can see next to the woman holding that sign is Catherine, who serves on the board of WDI USA. Also in the picture is Irene Lawrence, who also serves on the board of WDI USA. Amrita is in that photo, and I know she's here in the chat now. So this was sort of the feeling of what was going on. So this is Christy Hammer standing with another woman holding a WDI sign, Females Not a Hormone Level, and I don't know who that woman is. And if you're here today, I'm sorry that I don't recognize you. This is Elizabeth Chesick, the current president of WDI USA, giving her speech at the rally. And then the Library of Congress is in the background there. I don't know who this woman is. Again, if you are in the chat, I apologize for not recognizing you. But again, this is just sort of the mood that we were in at the rally. It was a beautiful day, too. So this is me standing with Kim Jones from Icons and Amy Ichikawa, who founded Woman to Woman, which fights for incarcerated women, and Bev Talbot, who might be in the chat today. Bev works with LGBT Courage Coalition and Women Are Real, doing outstanding work in California, and that's the Supreme Court behind us. This is just a bunch of signs. Again, that's Christy Hammer in the back with the WDI sign. This is saying chemical castration isn't medicine. And the woman behind the sign is holding a sign from Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. You can sort of see Jamie Reed struggling with a sign there in the background. She's with LGBT Courage Coalition and blew the whistle on the so-called gender clinic where she worked. No cross-sex hormones for kids. That's, you can't tell from the picture, but that's Julie Lane, who, again, works with Bev in California, fighting Scott Wiener and Gavin Newsom. So I had never seen these women. I have no idea who they were, but they were constantly dancing and chanting and holding signs from Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. And that's me and Amy Sousa, known heretic on social media. And I think the next slide is my speech. Okay, if we can play my speech and then I'll wrap it up.
Hello to all the sex realists out there. Congratulations. We have truth and justice on our side, even if the other side insists that sex isn't real, that if it's real, it's less important than people's made-up gender identities, or that people can change sex. My name is Kara Dansky. Thank you. I served as president of Women's Declaration International USA, now ably led by Elizabeth Chesick, from 2021 to 2024, and as a member of the board of directors of the Women's Liberation Front from 2016 to 2020. I'm a leftist radical feminist and have been a registered Democrat since 1990, except for a few years I spent as a registered Green before re-registering in order to vote in the Democratic presidential primary in 2008. Or, if you like, I'm a TERF. A lot of people don't realize how long feminists and other leftists have been fighting back against the lies of trans. The reason is that most mainstream legacy media outlets consistently, persistently, and insistently ignore the TERFs. In 1979, a lesbian radical feminist professor named Janice Raymond published a book titled The Transsexual Empire, essentially predicting everything that was to come. She republished it in 1994 with a new introduction about the emergence of a very dangerous word, transgender. People didn't listen to her then, and here we are now. In 2014, a journalist named Michelle Goldberg published an article in The New Yorker titled, What is a Woman? The Dispute Between Radical Feminism and Transgenderism. That was 2014. In it, she recounts an event in 1973 where a radical feminist named Robin Morgan said that she refused to refer to any man as she. It was in 2014, 8 years before 2022, that feminists were calling on people to confront the question, what is a woman? Feminists have been at this for a long time. We're just ignored. If people had listened to us over the past several decades, we might not be here. Wolf was founded in 2013 as an unapologetically radical feminist organization. As Margot said, its mission is to restore, protect, and advance the rights of women and girls as a sex class through legal argument, policy advocacy, and public education. In 2016, Wolf sued the Obama administration over its Title IX guidance. WGI was launched in 2019 to advance the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights globally, as Elizabeth explained. The U.S. chapter launched in 2020. I want to give a special shout out to a woman named Kaylee Triller, who I don't think is here today. A few years ago, she published an article in the Christian Post titled, Dear Christian Conservative Men, Please Stop Screwing Up the Trans Issue. She wrote, it was largely women who stepped up to the plate to fight. They did so without fanfare and at great personal cost. And the women who impressed me the most in this capacity were women who had the most to lose, the radical feminists. It's one thing to speak an unpopular truth into a crowd of people who support your position. It's another thing entirely to stand up to your own tribe. She was right, and her article is really worth a read. She was fired from her job at a Y in 2015 for refusing to make the locker rooms gender neutral. Thank you, Kaylee. In 2019, I was proud to stand with many of you on these very steps during a rally in a case that would eventually become Bostock versus Clayton County. I was proud to co-MC that rally with my friend Doreen Denny from Concerned Women for America. In closing, I will just say that the global feminist fight against the sexist, homophobic, authoritarian nonsense that is gender identity has all been documented in a 2023 book I published called The Reckoning, How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls. Women must always be able to call a man a man. We must be able to point out and acknowledge a man's sex. An average man can kill an average woman with his bare hands. He cannot be granted a right to hide his sex from her, not in locker rooms and not in sports. People who find their way to this movement often assume there's a reasonable middle way. I'm here to tell you there isn't. Mad respect and solidarity to every member of the movement to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls, which includes everyone standing here today. To those who have recently found their way to it, welcome to the fight. Stay rooted in truth. You don't need to yield even an inch.
So you can tell I'm a bit frustrated with the United States Supreme Court for leaving us where we are. Most of that noise, other than the cheering, that was coming from the other side. Someone asked how many people were on the other side. The answer is quite a few, but we were larger in number. Most of us think that we outnumbered them. That was not an easy speech to give. As you can tell, I was losing my voice. I had been losing my voice all morning, and I had to scream at the top of my lungs, even with that microphone and even with an excellent sound system. I will end there. It was a very good day. I don't think we'll get what we want from the current Supreme Court, but we should get something resembling a tepid win. I wish I had better news about what I think is going to happen in the cases, but I can confidently say that in the US, turfing has gone mainstream. We're a broad coalition with a wide diversity of political backgrounds represented. And regardless of what the Supreme Court does in these cases, those of us in this coalition all agree that women and girls are entitled to legal protection on the basis of our sex as demanded by the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. Thanks so much.
When will the Supreme Court give its verdict? Do people have to go along with it, or can they do what they've done in Britain, which is ignore our Supreme Court and just say it doesn't matter?
So a ruling is expected sometime this summer, probably June or July. And yes, I mean, people do have to go along with it. And I do think we'll get a majority ruling that these laws are constitutional. It's just that for a variety of reasons, I think they're going to use terrible language and they're not going to go nearly as far as I want them to, which is just to say flat out that women and girls exist as a sex class.
Can Cara speculate about the legal analysis she anticipates the majority of the Supreme Court will use?
So there's a question because these cases involve something called the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And in evaluating claims of sex discrimination under that, courts are supposed to test claims using something called intermediate scrutiny, but only for what are referred to, this is total legal jargon, and I'm very sorry, quasi-suspect class. A major question that the courts have been confronting is whether transgender refers to a quasi-suspect class. I very much want the court to say it is not. Interestingly, the ACLU was pushing for the court to do exactly that for years in these cases, and now it seems to have abandoned that because I think it knows it's likely to lose that. So I will be happy if the court comes out with a strong statement that trans is not a quasi-suspect class, but I don't think it will. I think it will simply say that these cases do not constitute sex discrimination. No, these laws do not constitute sex discrimination, which is fine. That'll be a good outcome. I'll be happy about that outcome. It just won't be as strong as I want it to be.
Are there any further SCOTUS turf cases coming up? The only other turf case I know of coming up is Florida's case against AAP, Endocrine Society in WPATH.
So not at the moment. There aren't any turf cases before the Supreme Court right now, but there are tons of cases all throughout the federal judiciary on sports and spaces, and of course the detransitioner cases, which I think is what you were referring to, all the detransitioner cases suing the AAP and WPATH and the individual medical providers who have done this to so many young people. There are just a ton of cases that are all throughout the federal judiciary. Any one of them could get there.
And we're now going to hear from April Chainey. And actually, it's incredibly appropriate, April, that we've got April here because April, she's from the USA and she says her bio is as follows. April Chainey, I'm a mum from Idaho and I just got into this in September 2024. So, which is very appropriate because we've had Tamarack and Sheila Jeffries, or Tamarack Verrall, Sheila Jeffries, who've been involved since the 60s and early 70s. And now, April, welcome to the struggle, as Cara said, since just a year and a bit ago. Can you tell us a bit about what peak trans you, or why you've got involved in the struggle and how you see things?
My peak trans was in September 2024 when our daughter, who is playing in the Mountain West NCAA Division One Women's Volleyball Conference, called and said, "Guess what? There's a guy on the San Jose State University women's volleyball team." And I was like, what? That actually happens? I didn't know. And I think there's just so many others out there like me. I thought I knew what was going on in the world, and I obviously did not know this was even an issue. I didn't know it existed. And so I've had to really learn a lot, I feel, in a very short amount of time to catch up. And I wish I had been listening to the feminists decades ago because I would have been involved then, but I am now. And so I'm just starting with my sphere of influence because I don't know what else to do. And I'm here and talking to you, which is something I would never have done before. So I'm definitely out of my comfort zone, but
Yeah.
it's important. We need to get out of our comfort zone because this is so important.
How did your daughter know it was a man? Like, was it very clear to her this? And then, secondly, what did you do once you heard about that? Did you sort of go on the internet? How did you research more?
It was told by the first team that had forfeited playing against this San Jose, which was Southern Utah University. It was preseason and they just declined to play. I mean, that just never happens. You just don't do that. And they wouldn't say on the record why, but it was told in the circles that it was because there was a guy on the team. So after realize that, oh my gosh, San Jose State University is in your conference and you will have to be playing them, that I just started to go online and parents started uniting on the team, which is University of Nevada, Reno, UNR. And we just started contacting people. And Icons was the one that really helped guide us and kind of caught us up a little bit with what was going on. And they were very helpful to the players and the parents as well. And they, in fact, helped the girls, I say girls, but they're, young adult women, draft a statement. And to this day, we are the only NCAA team that said why we were forfeiting playing against San Jose State University because it was for equal playing field. It was for safety. It was for
Safety,
fairness.
absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah. And has it had an impact? Has that had repercussions in the rest of the teams?
It encouraged all these other high school and middle school teams, all these other girls right now that are speaking up, and they are girls, they are minors that are speaking up right now. It encouraged them to say something because a lot of their dream is to move on to the next level, that collegiate level, and they are speaking up now. So I think sports is a common thread that people can kind of talk about this issue, and it's how I first got involved into it. And if it's maybe not sports, then it is the locker rooms. I mean, that's just common sense. I mean, nobody wants that for their daughter or niece or sister or granddaughter to be sharing that locker room with a man.
Are you finding that some of the young women, I guess men, disagree with you, and also your friends and family? Is the disagreement, or does everybody, now that you're aware of what's going on and you talk about it, does everyone agree with you?
No, they don't actually. I've definitely lost some family members. I think I've definitely had some struggles with my daughter actually, and the player on the team. But we have worked through it, and luckily we had a very firm, solid foundation. but we definitely struggled in the beginning because I was so outspoken, and I couldn't be quiet about it because I saw the implications of this. Is sports is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's so broad, and I think we've kind of gotten to common ground. She knows I'm all in, and I don't speak for her. She is to speak for herself, and that is her story to tell when she's ready to tell it. But I haven't stopped. In fact, I just heard wonderful news on the 14th of this month that my discrimination complaint against UNR was acknowledged and is being actively investigated. So I wrote that back in February of 2025. I actually forgot what I wrote because it was so long ago. But I was like, one, you can do something. You can speak up and bring this issue to awareness because mainstream media just doesn't talk about it. And so I found you guys on Instagram. And that's how I just kept following you and now I'm here.
Wow. And it's really interesting you saying that now, once you sort of found out more about the issue, you realized it's a very deep issue. It's the tip of the
Hmm.
iceberg, you said, and
Hmm.
also that you're now all in. Does
Hmm.
that mean that you've given up some hobbies or you're spending a lot of time on this or talking to people or you're quite an activist? How's it affected your life?
I've pretty much given up all my hobbies. This is my hobby, but I
Yeah.
actually enjoy it. I bought your book, The Reckoning, and I mean, just trying to finish that is just, even though I'm very interested. I mean, this is my full-time hobby, and I work. I work two jobs, so it's a lot, but I am committed, and I'm just speaking up to anyone that will listen.